In the heart of Europe, nestled among the dense forests and rolling hills, lies a forgotten battlefield from a war long past. The air still carries whispers of the horrors that unfolded there, and those who dare to venture close enough can feel the weight of the souls lost in the conflict. It was during the Great War that the land became a stage for unspeakable acts of violence and terror. Soldiers from opposing forces clashed in a frenzy of blood and desperation, each side determined to claim victory at any cost. Among them was Lieutenant Thomas Beckwith, a young officer fresh out of training and eager to prove himself on the battlefield. Thomas had heard tales of the horrors of war, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would witness in those dark, muddy trenches. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke of artillery fire. The constant barrage of shells had turned the once pristine landscape into a hellish wasteland, where every step could mean stepping on a landmine or stumbling upon a rotting corpse. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas and his comrades endured unimaginable hardships. They fought against not only the enemy but also disease, starvation, and the ever-present fear that they might never see home again. But amidst the chaos and despair, something far more sinister began to manifest. It started with whispers in the night, ghostly voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, Thomas dismissed them as the product of exhaustion and stress, but as the voices grew louder and more distinct, he couldn't ignore them any longer. One evening, as he sat huddled in the makeshift shelter of the trenches, Thomas heard his name being called out in a plaintive wail. He looked around, but there was no one there. His comrades were asleep or lost in their own thoughts, oblivious to the eerie presence that haunted their midst. The voices continued to torment Thomas, growing more insistent with each passing day. They spoke of death and despair, of lost souls condemned to wander the battlefield for eternity. Thomas tried to block them out, but they burrowed into his mind like worms, feeding on his fear and doubt. One night, as a thick fog blanketed the trenches, Thomas saw something that chilled him to the core. A figure emerged from the mist, its features obscured by shadows. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding over the uneven ground without making a sound. Thomas watched in horror as the figure approached, its eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. He tried to call out to his comrades, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure drew closer, reaching out with spectral hands that seemed to beckon him into the darkness. In a desperate act of defiance, Thomas raised his rifle and fired at the apparition. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the silent night, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, with a haunting shriek, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving Thomas shaken but alive. From that moment on, Thomas knew that the battlefield held secrets far more terrifying than the horrors of war. He saw other apparitions in the days that followed, each one more twisted and malevolent than the last. Some appeared as fellow soldiers, their bodies mangled and torn by unseen forces. Others took the form of civilians caught in the crossfire, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and terror. As the war raged on, Thomas became obsessed with uncovering the truth behind these spectral manifestations. He delved into old records and diaries, seeking clues to the dark history of the battlefield. What he discovered sent shivers down his spine. The land had once been home to an ancient cult, one that worshipped dark entities said to grant unimaginable power in exchange for blood sacrifices. The cult had been driven underground centuries ago, but their presence lingered in the soil, staining it with the echoes of their twisted rituals. Thomas realized that the voices he heard were not just the cries of the dead, but the whispers of those ancient entities, hungry for revenge and eager to claim new souls for their unholy cause. He knew that he had to put an end to their influence before it consumed him and his comrades completely. Armed with newfound knowledge and a resolve born of desperation, Thomas set out to confront the source of the haunting. He gathered a small group of trusted allies, fellow soldiers who had also sensed the malevolent presence lurking in the trenches. Together, they ventured into the heart of the battlefield, guided by the faint glimmer of unearthly energy that pulsed like a beacon in the darkness. The air grew colder as they drew closer, and the ground trembled beneath their feet as if warning them to turn back. But Thomas pressed on, his grip on reality slipping as the voices grew louder and more demanding.